This is Edward Siegel. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast. Each week, we look at how companies, organizations, and individuals in the news are responding to, managing, or recovering from a crisis, and what you can learn from their successes or failures. My observations and recommendations are based on my experience managing crisis situations and advising others on how to respond to and bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. My guest today is Lane Kasselman, the former head of communications for Uber. But before I bring Lane on, I want to say something about a company's potential exposure to different kinds of crisis situations. There are three important factors every company and organization should take into account when planning and preparing for a crisis: geography, weather, and the economy. Where companies are located can increase the likelihood that they may have to deal with a particular kind of crisis, such as earthquakes, hurricanes, tropical storms, tornadoes, or snowstorms. Unfortunately, the current national public health emergency can make any nature-related crisis even worse. On top of that, there is a continuing economic impact of the pandemic. These worst-case scenarios come true underscore the need to prepare for anything that Mother Nature might throw at you. That means having a crisis management plan and contingency plans so that you will know what to do when a crisis strikes, where to do it, how to do it, who will do it, when to do it, and why to do it. It also means testing your plans on a frequent basis to ensure that the plans will work when needed and that your crisis management team will work well together. If you wait until a disaster hits your organization to come up with a plan to deal with it, you will make it even more challenging to respond to, manage, and recover from the crisis. I've written a new book that provides important advice on how you can prevent, manage, and recover from dozens of different kinds of crisis situations. Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Crisis Ahead is now available as a paperback book wherever books are sold and as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Crisis Ahead is filled with case studies about how companies and public figures have prepared for and handled crisis situations, and the important lessons you can learn from their successes and failures. The book also includes checklists and exercises to help you get ready for and react to a crisis. You can learn more about the book at publicrelations.com. It's not too early to start preparing for the next crisis. That's because history shows there is always a next crisis, and the sooner you are ready for it, the better. My guest today is Lane Kasselman. Lane is the former head of communications for Uber. He has spent over 2 decades consulting on public policy, crisis strategy, and communications for blue-chip and startup companies. Lane is now managing partner of Greenbriar Partners in San Francisco. Welcome to the podcast, Lane.
Thanks, Edward. I'm so happy to be here.
What were some of the crisis situations you had to deal with at Uber?
Yeah, well, the crazy thing about Uber now is that it's pretty much considered synonymous with crisis. But back when I started, it wasn't. I joined very early on when the company was still relatively new, and we didn't really have more than maybe one crisis a month. Now, of course, Uber has hundreds a day. But during that time that I was there, the number of crises per day accelerated from that one per month to dozens per week. And so we had to develop a crisis strategy pretty quickly. And there was one crisis in particular that really cemented how the company both learned to deal with crises and even to this day still manages them. And in fact, it really is something that I use myself in managing crises for other companies. So I want to take you back to January of 2015. So the company was only a couple years old, right? Only 3 years old at this point. And was only in about 60, I think, to 70 cities around the world. Of course, Uber's in 500 plus cities now, and was doing on average a couple 100,000 rides a day, but nowhere near the tens of millions of rides that happen right now. And New York City was one of the biggest markets for Uber. I think today still is. I haven't been there. I haven't been to worked at Uber in many years, but I think it is still one of their biggest markets. And it was a typical rainy January Saturday, and an Uber driver had a collision with two pedestrians who were crossing the street. and a very, very tragic accident in which one of the two victims was killed and the other one was seriously injured. And I'm not bringing the story up to make light of it or be flip, but it really does illustrate a point for managing crises and sort of what we learned. So, I got the call about this on Saturday shortly after it happened, and got on a plane the next morning, first flight out from San Francisco to New York, realizing that, Uber had a couple of fatalities, either drivers or pedestrians or passengers that had occurred since it launched, but not very many. So this is one of the first. And, the press on it had been pretty challenging. And we were certainly concerned with the potential chilling impact to people wanting to even use the service. And so on the way out, I really was trying to figure out how could we message this crisis to avoid the maximum amount of impact. How could we, make sure we manage it, knowing that this was going to, be every headline in New York over the next several days. And one of the things that had happened in the previous month was that, and again, these are more morbid topics, but it's relevant to the discussion. In the previous month, an Air China plane had crashed, and Air China, in its response to it, was fascinating. What they did was their statement was sympathetic, and then followed by a laundry list of facts. Here's everything we know, and it really did a great job at showing that the company was transparent. And so while I was on a flight headed out, I was looking at the story, thinking about how they managed it, and looking at the subsequent coverage to that Air China crash. Now, if you go back and try and find this crash, you can't, because there really wasn't very much press coverage of it, unlike other major incidents like this. So anyway, I thought, what? Maybe that's what we should do here. We should show our sympathy, but then we also should just lay out the facts, be totally transparent. And so we developed a statement that did just that. And sure enough, by Tuesday of that week, all the coverage had been contained in New York. The press didn't think that we were hiding anything. And we actually were able to show that we were being transparent and honest. Now that strategy is still in use today. And they call it, here's what we know, right? It's a here's what we know statement. And it basically just starts like that. It's, starts with some empathy and really the reaction from the company, followed by here's what we know and a laundry list of facts. And it really does a good job at localizing crises.
What was your secret for managing so many crisis situations?
Yeah, lots of exercise, right, to keep you sane. But I think at Uber there's a couple of realizations, right? So one was not every crisis is going to be the end of the business, right? In fact, we categorize them into 4 different categories. A level 4 crisis being some that were potentially serious to the company, right? They could cause some sort of change in evaluation or cause some sort of impact to how customers are viewing the company. But most crises on a daily basis fit into lower categories. And so they're not really going to impact your customer base really beyond the immediate area that's impacted by it. And so for us, it was really just taking a scientific approach to how do crises and the different categories of crises impact the company's operations. And for better or for worse, most crises don't have an impact to daily operations.
How do you think Uber has handled crisis situations since you left the company?
Well, I'm biased. I think they handled them better when I was there. But no, I think, in all fairness, look, the company is doing tens of millions of rides every day, right? So the likelihood that something bad happens on a platform is very high. That's just the odds, right? There's car accidents every day, whether or not you're in an Uber vehicle or not. And there's criminals engaging in criminal conduct every day. And so I think that the company does a pretty good job at managing through those crises. They've built a really large team, and there is a support center, I think, based in Arizona that helps manage these crises for the people that are involved. But for them, they realized that the scale of the business required that they took the issue seriously and built up an apparatus around it. So look, I think we're not going to see an end to this, right? Just like Walmart has a crisis in the parking lot in the store every day, Uber's going to have them every day too.
Is there a correlation between how much business a company does and how often they'll have to confront a crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our practice, as we see companies scale, especially if they're consumer facing, the scale of crisis goes right along with it.
So what's the message here? That the more business you do, the more likely it is you're going to need a crisis management plan, and the more you need to test it to make sure it works?
Yeah, Edward, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? It's planning. So I think it's these days with how fast media cycles are and the fact that anyone can be a reporter, right? Anybody who's got access to a computer can be a journalist, or can be, can have a podcast, or be a blogger. And so the ability for news to be spread on Twitter or somebody's other social channels is pretty fast, and it's pretty easy. And so the reality is, as any business is scaling, if you've got any kind of public-facing apparatus, or frankly, even if you're an enterprise company, but you're scaling so fast that your reach eventually touches consumers in sort of the chain of business, you got to prepare for it. And that's kind of what you just said. It's preparation, and it's not if a crisis is going to happen; it's when. And it's not, I'm not saying this to scare anybody, but any good communications team, and certainly there's plenty of consultants out there, or even folks that are just relatively smart and have the time to focus on it, can predict what those likely reputational risks are, and then prepare for them. Either try and avoid them, or if you're going to run into them, have a plan in place so you're not scrambling at the last minute. But that good preparation is what we see smart companies do.
A lot of people rely on apps in their personal, professional, and business lives. I understand you had a client who made an app, and that company had a crisis. What can you tell us about that situation?
Yeah, so I have a consulting firm now that deals with crises, and one of our oldest clients is the social network for athletes. It's called Strava, and I'm a user and a fan, and I hope some of your listeners are as well. And they both help you engage with other athletes, and also let you track and monitor your own exercise data. And one of the things that they do for years is that as you're exercising, you track where you're going, right? So if you're running around the block and you upload the data, there'll be a map will show up that'll show the kind of a red line trail of where you exercised. Now, Strava's got millions and millions of members all around the world. And every year, in December, traditionally, they would release their global heat maps, right? And these maps were showing where people exercised all over the world. And the brighter the red line, the more people were exercising on that particular route. So, for example, Central Park, New York, right, was lit up bright red because people are always running around it or riding their bike around it. But what Strava didn't realize was that over the course of a couple of years, one of the biggest users of their app are members of the military. And I did not have the pleasure of serving, but as I understand it, several members of the armed forces like to exercise by running the perimeter of their bases. It's a common, and what some of the members were doing on classified military installations were running the perimeters of those bases and then uploading the data, not realizing that when Strava was releasing their heat maps, they were actually releasing the location of some clandestine bases in various parts of the world. And a security researcher in Australia, I think, identified that there were some rumored bases that were then verified by the appearance of this data. And it turned into a really large media cycle. There were tens of thousands of stories being hitting every day over the course of a week when this hit. And so when that happened, Strava, who had been a long-time client at this time, my entire team moved in. And, Strava, everything stopped there, right? And sometimes, this is that level 4 crisis I was talking about, where everyone from the CEO and the board, down to frontline employees is focused on, figuring out how to solve it. And so we were there with them, arm in arm, figuring out the correct messaging, how to be transparent, both how to engage with regulators and the government who had questions, as well as, blocking and tackling the just, extreme volume of press that, their press team at the time was 2 people. And so very challenging for them to deal with it all. And so, what we found was that, again, leading with empathy, right? Showing that, the company had no intention of putting any members of the military in harm's way, but also showing that, this was a vulnerability created not necessarily by Strava, but by the members themselves, and that the military probably needed to do a little bit of a better job regulating what type of information the members of the armed services were, recording on their personal devices, as well as then just laying out the facts, right? Being completely honest and transparent. Over the course of a week's storm, we were able to turn the coverage from, primarily negative to, fully transparent and honest. And really now these days, the company has really sort of benefited from that media cycle because obviously the notoriety, but also, their ability to be a reputable company in the space. They didn't try to hide anything, right? They showed that they were truly being honest, and it has really bolstered the relationship with both municipal government and state and federal government sort of all over the world.
Was there any talk at the time that the app would be banned by the Pentagon?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the DoD was they were kind of confused, right? Because they were not aware that although, each branch has its own regulations for how members use their personal devices, they weren't aware that this was even a potential vulnerability. So I think, they weren't necessarily critical of the company and calling for its ban, but several of the branches did impose stricter regulations on usage of different types of tracking or location-based apps while on base or while deployed.
It sounds like there are two crisis management lessons here. For companies, the lesson is to know your product. And for consumers, the lesson is know the product you're using. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. I know it's so hard every time we get a new app to sort of read all of those terms and conditions and disclosures, but they really are eye-opening when you do.
Tell us something about your services and your expertise and how people can find out more about your company.
Yeah, thanks so much. So Greenbriar is almost 5 years old, started by myself and another person named Matt McKenna. He was President Clinton's communications director for about a decade. We started the company to help various small, mid-sized, and now at this point, large and multinational corporations with crises. Since then, we've expanded a bit. We got acquired a couple years ago by the Messina Group, started by Jim Messina, the Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House and Obama's campaign manager on the re-elect. So we're a wholly owned subsidiary of that firm. And so since then, we've expanded. We do a little bit more now, also in the PR space and the public affairs space. But half our practice is primarily still in crisis. And that's frankly where Matt and I spend most of our time. And we really do two things. So we do what we like to call preventative medicine. So we help companies, just like we talked about, do that prediction work in identifying likely reputational risk and then preventing it or preparing for it. And then we also do emergency room surgery. So middle of the night, house is on fire, something just bad happened or something out of the ordinary, which these days is basically a crisis. And so we help companies with that. And our company list now isn't just tech. So we've got multinational corporations, professional sports teams, celebrities, high net worth individuals, kind of all over the map. But we started in tech and we still feel a lot of respect for that industry. The site is greenbriar.partners. So not .com, just greenbriar.partners. And all the information about us is right there. You can also find me on social. So Twitter, just at Kasselman, Kasselman. Same thing on LinkedIn and Facebook.
On the campaign trail, there can be a crisis every day. How did your experience working on political campaigns help you prepare to go into crisis management?
Well, there's nothing like the stress of a crisis on a campaign trail. I did work for Hillary on our first run for president, and I didn't know anything about crisis management back then. That was prior to my expertise and prior to working at Uber and all those things. But I remember one day I was responsible for dealing with media on the trail with her, and we were set up for a press conference. And oftentimes candidates have a huge row of flags behind them. And so, we had all the press, I think we were in Iowa, we had, the country's press lined up, ready to film her come out. I don't remember what the announcement was. And we had this row of flags. And it was my job to set up the flags as well as get the press set and ready to go. And she comes out and her shoulder brushes one of the flags and it causes a cascading effect that all the American flags go tumbling down like dominoes. And I have never felt I have two kids. I've never felt as much stress in my life as that moment. For what was going to happen. I thought maybe I ended her presidential campaign in that very moment. And so what I learned then was nothing I can do in the crisis world is going to make me feel, or nothing that I'm helping somebody manage is going to make me feel as stressed as that moment. So as long as I've got that as my bottom, I know that I can always recover pretty fast. So fortunately, that wasn't the thing that ended her presidential run, but I was pretty worried.
My guest today was Lane Kasselman, the managing partner for Greenbriar Partners in San Francisco. Thanks again for joining me today, Lane.
Edward, thanks so much. And if you have a chance, please get Edward's book, Crisis Ahead. I enjoyed the read.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Crisis Ahead podcast. Remember, it's not a matter of if companies and organizations will have a crisis, but when.